Hey guys, as always, Coach Barreline with you with the next video lesson. Today we're going to talk about the great stock market crash of 1929. We're also going to discuss kind of the underlying economic problems that lead to the crash, some things that were kind of beneath the surface during the boom time of most of the 1920s that a lot of people missed, and some weaknesses. And you'll go through and you'll see a lot of the same kind of parallels as you see with the 2008 stock market collapse and 2008 recession and the recession of 2009 that followed it. Obviously, however, though, as we talk about the New Deal, we'll see that the social safety net that was in place in 08, 09, and 2010 was not during the Great Depression, which made the recession even worse and made it spiral into what becomes known as the Great Depression. Anyway, so there were a lot of economic factors that contributed to this crash. And between 1922 and 1928, the gross national product, or total value of all goods and services produced in the United States or produced by the U.S. economy, actually almost raised by 50%, about 40% increase. And farmers and other workers may not have been benefited, but the overall economy was humming along pretty well, especially for automakers and the ancillary industries that spun off of the auto industry. So as a result, unemployment remained low, averaging around 5% between 1923 and 1929. So as a result, union membership slowed down, and as employers expanded the welfare capitalism or employee benefits in lieu of paying their workers higher wages. So this feeling of prosperity, encouraged workers to buy new products and enjoy new leisure activities such as movies, going to sporting events, and kind of expanded the kind of high living lifestyle to the working middle and working class that it had never really had it so well before. Also, the stock market was strong. Stock values were increasing month after month after month, and this steep rise in stock prices created what becomes known as boom psychology. And the boom psychology basically says that the stock market is going to keep going up, things are going to always be good, and we're all going to get rich. So more and more ordinary Americans, working class, middle class Americans, began buying into the stock market. As a result, the number of shares traded tripled from about 3 million, or I'm sorry, more than tripled. Well, no, tripled from about 318 million in 1920 to over a billion in 1929. Business leaders again pushed stocks as a way for everybody to make money and prepare for their future and gain wealth. Many Americans thought that the prosperity of the 20s proved the triumph of American business, and public confidence in the government, or at least the lack of government intervention in business, was high. Harding and Coolidge both favored policies that were laissez-faire, helped business, and they were very popular and easily won their elections. However, Coolidge, who didn't really like being president all that much, didn't run for re-election in 1928, and the Republicans chose Herbert Hoover, who kind of promises to continue in the philosophy of his predecessors. Hoover had been on Harding and Coolidge's cabinets. He had overseen America's food production during World War I, and he had an outstanding reputation as an administrative leader. His opponent was a New York governor by the name of Al Smith, Brooklyn guy, but he was Catholic, and the first Catholic to run for president, and that was a huge obstacle to him because of his religion and because he opposed prohibition. So Hoover's campaign painted him as the candidate of the Pope and of liquor. So Hoover easily wins the election, but it really demonstrates the conflicts that were dividing the nation kind of under the surface. And while many Americans were enjoying good fortune in the 20s, there were some, like I said, some serious problems underneath the surface. One was wealth inequality. the uneven distribution of wealth in the United States. And in fact, during this time, the wealthiest 1% of the population's income grew 75%. But the average worker only saw a 10% gain. For most Americans, rising prices, inflation actually swallowed up the 10% gain that they earned in salary and wages. Coal miners and farmers were especially hard hit. But by 1929, even with this great economic expansion, by 1929, 70% or more of American families had too low of an income to enjoy a good standard of living. 4 out of every 5 families didn't save any money at all during the boom years because of this. And the advent of credit allowed Americans to buy expensive goods. But at the end of the decade, people had reached their credit limits. They had reached the limits of what they could afford to borrow and buy, and purchases slowed. But businesses kept pumping out all these new products as a result of mass production and assembly line, and warehouses became filled with goods that no one could afford to buy. So you have income inequality, you have inflation, you have easy credit, and you have overproduction. And all of these things kind of combine to create this kind of powder keg that's going to get set off by the stock market crash. Credit was also a negative impact on the stock market, as investors could use credit to buy stocks as the market rose. This is called buying on the margin. Basically, stockbrokers would loan investors money, on the idea that they could pay the stockbroker, that the investors could pay the stockbrokers back with the profits they gained from the stock market, which is all well and good as long as the market kept increasing. It was risky, though, because if stocks went down, investors would be in debt to the stockbrokers and they wouldn't have any money, and the stockbrokers would lose money that they had loaned. And what happens is, as stock markets start to tumble a little bit, brokers begin to make all these margin calls, basically calling their clients and saying, their investors are saying, I want my money. And of course, the investors don't have it. So it's all predicated on the idea that the stock market is going to continue to increase. The Federal Reserve, which kind of the nation's central bank, did worry about the nation's interest in stock and decided to make it harder to make margin loans. And initially the move was successful, limited margin loans, but then American corporations kind of moved in, and basically they began loaning money to brokers to loan out for margin loans. So the buying continued to increase after that. So steady growth of the early 1920s led to the peak in early September 1929. But some investors were starting to see trouble as consumer purchasing fell and the rumors of a collapse started to circulate. So on Thursday, October 24th, 1929, some nervous investors began selling their stocks. Others followed, and this creates a huge sell-off with no buyers. Stock prices plunge, and it triggers an even greater panic to sell. So toward the end of that Thursday, the leading bankers kind of joined together to buy a bunch of stocks to prevent a further collapse. And this was basically effective in stopping the panic through that Friday. So they go into the weekend, everything seems to have stabilized. But next Monday, the market sinks again, and then Black Tuesday, which would have been, the 8th, October 29th, was the worst day, which affected stocks of even solid companies. So the damage was widespread and catastrophic. In a few short days, the market dropped by a value of $16 billion. Talking about half of its pre-crash value was wiped out in a matter of basically 5 days. And the effects of the crash are almost immediate. Many thought the market would rally. Still, countless individuals were ruined. Margin buyers were hit the hardest because brokers started to make margin calls demanding their payment back. And of course, investors had to sell their stocks for far less than they had purchased them to pay off their loans. Most of them had to clean out their life savings to make up the difference. In the end, many investors owed enormous amounts of money to their brokers, and most have no stocks or savings left to pay their debts, which means that a lot of brokers go out of business as well. This also triggers a banking crisis. Depositors rush to withdraw their money, which drain the bank of funds. And banks had also invested directly or indirectly, oftentimes, in the stock market by buying company stocks or by lending brokers money to loan to investors on the margins. So what happens is investors couldn't repay the margins, stockbrokers couldn't repay the banks, and the banks begin to lose money. And as people go to withdraw more and more of their savings from the bank, basically the banks run out of money. And when a bank runs out of money, it goes out of business. So some of you that may not understand the way banks work, if you put $100, if you deposit $100 into your banking account, they don't just keep $100 sitting there. They take part of that money, they set it aside for their reserve, then they take the rest of it and loan it out so they can make money and interest. So basically what happened, if everybody that had an account at the bank showed up at the bank at one time and said, I want my money, they wouldn't have enough money to cover the loss, to cover the withdrawals. So what happens is many of these banks go out of business and people lose their entire life savings practically overnight. So banks cut off lending, they fail, and as a result, banks can't get loans or businesses can't get loans from the banks to expand and grow. So businesses begin to be crushed by this crash. Consumers begin to cut back on their spending on everything but the essentials. So companies had to lay off workers because of decreased demand. Unemployment led to even less demand, and it creates this cycle that continues for really over a decade. In the year after the crash, American wages dropped by $4 billion and almost 3 million people lost their jobs. The fragile economies of Europe, which were still struggling, had borrowed a lot of money from American banks. And now the banks are calling those governments because they need the money. They're saying, we want our money back. U.S. buying power was down. The United States was kind of driving demand throughout Europe at the time. So exports went down, and governments began to try to protect themselves from foreign competition by passing high tariffs. This makes foreign goods more expensive and basically locks up global trade throughout the entire decade of the 1930s. It actually makes goods more expensive and makes it harder for the economies to recover. So these governments trying to protect themselves actually make things worse during this time. So by the height of the Great Depression, you have 1 out of every 4 Americans unemployed, although the actual numbers were probably higher than that because figures at the time didn't take into account women, for instance. 1 out of 4 people was unemployed. You had massive migration to the West as people left looking for work. You had failures of farms, banks, businesses disappear nearly overnight. I mean, it's a massive change and an unprecedented change in American society. And at the core, it really rattles Americans' belief in the American system, not just economic system, but also system of government. It's going to lead eventually to a radical change in the way Americans view the role of their government. We'll see how that change takes shape when we talk about the New Deal in the next video. So we'll begin talking about that next time. See you.